Hello and welcome to JupyterCon 2020. I am Reshma Sheikh, Diversity Chair for the conference. I am pleased to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Tema Okun. Dr. Okun has spent over 30 years doing work in racial justice and equity. She currently co-leads the Teaching for Equity Fellows program at Duke University, which works with faculty seeking to develop stronger skills both teaching about race and racism and across lines of race, class, and gender. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Emperor Has No Clothes, Teaching About Race and Racism to People Who Don't Want to Know, and the widely used article, White Supremacy Culture. Dr. Okun joins us from North Carolina, and her talk is entitled Tackling Toxic Culture in Tech, Racism and Its Legacy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. So I'm here to talk about tackling toxic culture in tech, about racism and its legacy in the tech community. In other words, I'm here to talk about your stake in racial justice as members of a community living into the mission of bringing together data scientists, business analysts, researchers, educators, developers, and tool creators to live into your potential, to meet our disparate needs and to solve our disparate problems. I need to be honest and say I'm not any kind of expert on technology, nor am I a member of the tech community. However, I have spent over 3 decades of my life learning about racism and how it operates. And one of the things I know about, I do know is that the tech community, like every community, is living with a legacy of racism that is both widespread and persistent. Like every community, the legacy of racism that you are navigating includes what I call both the content, what you produce, and the process, how you produce it. So for example, a recent MIT technology review outlines all the ways that technology has been developed for use in racial profiling, ranging from its use by police to target people based on darker skin color, to disproportionately identify Latinx people as illegal, to the development of algorithms that reinforce already discriminatory lending and hiring policies. So that's an example of content. In terms of process, an LA Times article offers firsthand stories by Black, Indigenous, and professionals of color, what I will refer to from here on out as BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, and people of color, about the persistent indignities of their lived experience in tech, ranging from overt discrimination to daily microaggressions. Stories from people working at Pinterest, Google, Snap, StubHub, to name just a few. A Pew Research study verifies this lived experience, documenting pervasive discriminatory exclusion from promotion and important assignments, lower pay, isolation, and assumptions of incompetence. So when I talk about the toxic legacy of racism in the tech community, I'm also referring to how technology as a community and as a field is invited daily into a culture of take it for granted racism, one that does not require intent. So this invitation is to participate in an ideology or a system of beliefs that support and reinforce an intersecting weave of policies and practices and behaviors that position white, Western, profit-centered ways of being and doing as both superior and normal, and that position policies and practices and behaviors that simplify the exclusion, underserving, exploitation, invalidation, and violation of whole communities of people based on race in the name of profit. So I'm going to say that again. The invitation into racism is one that is inviting you to participate in an ideology or a system of beliefs that support and reinforce an intersecting weave of policies and practices and behaviors that position white, Western, profit-centered ways of being and doing as both superior and normal, and that position policies and practices and behaviors that justify the exclusion, underserving, exploitation, invalidation, and violation of whole communities of people based on race in the name of profit. This is not news to you. In fact, my guess is if you are a BIPOC person listening to this talk, this is such old news that it makes your bones ache. My guess is if you're a white person listening to this talk, you may be feeling any range of things, including resentment at having to hash over such old news, in part because it feels like an indictment of white people generally, and perhaps you personally. So you need to know I'm not interested in indicting anyone. One of the reasons we have a hard time talking about racism in this country is because so often those of us who are white are afraid it's really a conversation about who's bad and who's good, and we're afraid we're going to find out we're the bad ones. BIPOC people are afraid if they show their justified anger, they'll be labeled as overly emotional, as having an agenda, as fulfilling another stereotype. That's not what this talk's about. I'm not interested in labeling anyone good or bad because we are all of us both in different ways. I'm white and I'm fabulous. I'm white and I am conditioned into racism like every other white person, and I have to take responsibility for that if I want to be happy. I'm also very okay with emotion and anger and agendas, especially when those agendas are about helping us to do better. This talk is about the legacy of racism in technology, and what I can tell you with absolute certainty is that defensiveness and denial and forced silences are part of this legacy. This is how racism works, to make us tired and enraged and resentful and defensive, and if we allow ourselves guilty and ashamed. Here's something else we need to know if we don't already. Racism is the handmaiden of white supremacy. And when I use the word or the term white supremacy, I'm not talking about the Klan or the Proud Boys or the white nationalists, who certainly do embody our understanding of that word. These people and organizations are simply living loudly into an ideology that we're all navigating. When I say racism is the handmaiden of white supremacy, I mean that racism is what white supremacy produces. White supremacy is an ideology, one that got an early foothold in 1640 when a Virginia court sentenced John Punch to a life of enslavement. John Punch, a Black man, had attempted to escape from indentured servitude with two similarly indentured friends, one a Scotsman, the other a Dutchman. Once caught, the court punished all three with 40 lashes, which was a harsh punishment even for that time. The court then condemned Punch to a lifetime of enslavement, while sentencing his two co-conspirators to a much lighter sentence of extended servitude. This is the first example of legalized white privilege before the word white even existed as a racialized term. This ideology was reinforced when the Virginia House of Burgesses years later began using the word white to organize different European nationalities into a shared racial identity in order to manage and justify indigenous land theft and the massive enslavement of peoples from Africa. So white supremacy is a pervasive ideology. It's a set of beliefs that position white as normal and better and Black as abnormal and deficit. White supremacy invented race as a social and political construct, not biologically real, yet nonetheless very real, toxic hierarchy of value. I want to take you back to that scene in the courthouse where John Punch and his Scotsman and Dutchman friend are sitting side by side, carrying those different sentences. How are they making sense of it, these three friends who risked everything to escape together? How do they hold the inevitable disconnect that such a sentence is going to produce? For this is what we need to understand if we don't understand anything else, and if you don't take anything else from this talk. The purpose of white supremacy and racism is to keep us disconnected from each other, from ourselves, from source, whether you consider that God or spirit or creativity or the magic of code. We're all swimming in the water of white supremacy, and as a result, racism has become ordinary. The water is polluted, the water is toxic, and we are all affected. So while it's easy to point the finger at overt white supremacists, and we see too many of them feeling empowered in our current political climate, the painful truth is we are all navigating a culture that tells us on a daily basis that white is both normal and better, that white is the standard, and that white is the desired state. When an African-American tech worker says, as one does in the stories I referenced earlier, that, quote, I can't really think of any space I've been in where white people make the assumption I don't know how to code, that I don't have tech skills, that I got a job because of affirmative action, end of quote. When that experience is reflected in the stories of BIPOC people again and again, we know we are swimming in the waters of white supremacy, culture, and racism. And here's the thing, white supremacy and racism do not require intent. We don't have to get up in the morning and say, well, I think I'm going to be a racist today, to believe without even thinking about it that our coworker of color isn't as smart as us or deserving as us or as skilled as us. If you are a white person who's had a thought like this, and I would make the claim that all of us who are white, if we're honest with ourselves, have thoughts like this, because this is exactly how we've been taught to think, then please know we are accepting an invitation into a culture that encourages us to assume we are qualified because we are the default and the norm, and that encourages us to question the qualifications of anyone we've been taught to consider other. We've been encouraged to see ourselves as unique individuals, while Black and brown people are grouped into generalizations that assume a racialized deficit, assumptions we rarely make about a white colleague, no matter how incompetent. And again, none of this requires intent. All I have to do is fail to see all the ways in which the culture reminds me on a daily basis that I'm qualified, good, the standard, deserving, or if I'm not deserving, I should be, while also telling me that those who are Black or brown are unqualified, suspect, criminal, and undeserving, or if not deficit, then the exception. I'm not comfortable saying these words, and this is how white supremacy and racism work. They encourage us to direct our anger at the person claiming racism or sexism or homophobia or ageism, rather than at the racism or sexism or homophobia itself. They have built-in levels of denial and defensiveness that have us obsessed with claiming our innocence rather than taking the simple step of saying, "Tell me more," so that we can see how our complicity with such toxicity is getting in our own way. And often, too often, so often, we are invited into this complicity without even knowing we've accepted the invitation. I'm not saying this to let anyone off the hook. There's absolutely nothing good or healthy or desirable for any of us when we cooperate with white supremacy and racism. Our cooperation, our complicity is toxic both to us and to those we deem as other. And that's why I'm here, to say out loud that we're all conditioned, white, black, brown, we're all conditioned, and if we want to be truly free, we need to turn down the constant invitations we receive to participate. The logical consequence of a culture that has over centuries justified racialized genocide, land theft, and enslavement, that has over centuries fine-tuned defensiveness and denial about the persistence and devious adaptability of white supremacy and racism, logical consequence is the persistent reproduction of ways of thinking and behaving that at worst promote and at best allow the dehumanization of whole groups of people based on race. When we dehumanize and degrade one segment of our population, that dehumanization and degradation seep inevitably into every aspect of the culture. A dehumanizing approach cannot be contained in the end. It begins to shape the way we think about all lives and all life. It begins to devalue all lives and all life. So if this is the toxic legacy of white supremacy and racism, the question must be asked, what is the role of technology to do something about it? You are the ones who can answer this question. Do you want to serve justifications of white supremacy and racism, of profit at all costs, of dehumanization and disconnection? I feel pretty certain that your answer to that question is no. And my research about your community offers up values like excellence, innovation, inquiry, curiosity, the common good, sustainability, integrity, respect. These values are by definition your very stake in racial justice. And these are radical values in today's world where we're witness to mediocrity, a notion of innovation perverted by the drive for profit at all costs, a lack of curiosity about our interdependence and relationships with each other, a focus on individual power at the expense of the common good. We're witness to growing environmental and economic unsustainability, a collapse of integrity, and an almost complete lack of mutual respect for one another. And if we're paying attention, we see how Black and brown people and communities are disproportionately targeted, affected, and violated by this distortion of our values. This is certainly true in the tech community, given the examples I articulated earlier. This also includes all the ways in which access to technology, creating it, driving it, using it, developing it, is disproportionately challenging for those who are Black and brown and all those who are poor, including many white people. As I said before, the purpose of white supremacy and racism is to disconnect us from each other in pursuit of profit for a few, to disconnect white people and communities from BIPOC people and communities, to disconnect white people and communities from each other, to disconnect BIPOC people and communities from each other, to disconnect each of us from ourselves, to disconnect each of us from spirit, source, creativity, or whatever you name the energy that connects all of us. White supremacy and racism are designed to disconnect us from the earth, the water, the wind, the sky, the sun. White supremacy and racism are designed to exploit all living things in order to generate power and profit for a few. White supremacy is an exploitation and extraction project. So your stake and our stake in racial justice is knowing that while technology can and is being used to reproduce and perpetuate white supremacy and racism today and every day, you have a role to play in shaping technology to serve connection instead, to serve equity and democracy and sustainability. In this moment, in this day, we are, by all accounts, at a precipice. And this is not a moment for correction. This is a moment for radical transformation. It's a moment to go beyond what so many call diversity and inclusion. We need a radical rethinking and restructuring that centers and honors and builds power with and among those most impacted. My work with colleagues over these 3 decades has resulted in the development of 10 racial equity principles, and one of those is the importance of honoring and building power at the margins. I emphasize this because when white-led and predominantly white communities turn to diversity and inclusion as their strategy of choice, the unspoken goal is usually, let's include a diverse group of people into what? If we finish that sentence, we realize that this framing implies the goal is that we, the white ones, should invite more bodies of color to sit around the table to ensure they have access to some of the same resources and opportunities as the white people at the table. The underlying assumption is that this white world is the desired world, the normal world, the default world that we should all aspire to. But what we already know, if we're paying any attention at all, is that this white world is in deep trouble and its values completely askew. So what we need is an entirely new table, or perhaps no table at all. White supremacy and racism like to pretend there's one right way to do something and our job is to find it. Not only is our job to find it, only certain qualified people can bring expertise to the search. And the qualified people are determined by other qualified people in a chain of qualification that has excluded not only Black and brown people, but entire cultural ways of knowing and centuries of cultural wisdom and genius. The ability to build the world we seek and the technological solutions to our current problems require deep open-heartedness to new ways of knowing and being that only are available to you beyond who you currently are and what you currently know. So let's take a breath. Because you might be hearing, particularly those of you who are white, that I'm telling you you're not enough in some way. And here's the contradiction I'm asking you to hold. You are wonderful, you are perfect, and you're not enough. All of us are wonderful, all of us are perfect, and we're not enough. These times require a new kind of leadership, one willing to admit that we are good and we are wonderful and we're not enough. Every time a person in leadership, or any of us for that matter, overlooks, dismisses, targets a Black, Indigenous, or colleague of color because of racist conditioning, as every time that person in leadership, or any of us for that matter, participates in disconnection and discard. Disconnection from and across people and communities, discard of ways of being and knowing that the tech community desperately needs. Every time a person in leadership, or any of us for that matter, participates in racism, we've not only participated in oppression, we have limited ourselves and our options and what's possible beyond what we currently know. One of the key principles of critical race theory is that people and communities of color are in a unique position to bring perspectives that those of us in the dominant culture cannot know. And this is true even as we know that racial identity does not define us or prescribe us. This truth reflects what it means to really value diversity, to acknowledge the limits of any knowing based on a particular lived experience, and to be thirsty for new ways of knowing that those who've lived and loved and survived and thrived differently can and do offer in a syncretic, creative, and respectful exchange. And you, the tech community, more than any other community, are leaders in how we value the innovation and creativity that new ways of thinking and being have to offer. So how ironic that this community is so predominantly white when technology is a field with a high stake in diverse thinking and being. I'm not saying this to make you feel self-conscious or ashamed. I'm saying this to help you realize how an authentic commitment to equity expands possibility. The leadership currently on display in our national landscape is afraid of diverse thinking, afraid of intelligence in any form, clinging instead to a very narrow definition of greatness attached to abuse and misuse of power. The current leadership model encourages lack of accountability and disconnect in service of profit for a few. The current leadership model has little to no practice leading for the common good, little to no practice of shared leadership, little to no practice of the ability to admit the creative power of vulnerability. What we so desperately need are leadership models that offer support for the skills that we also need, navigating the inevitable tensions between individual and collective rights and responsibilities, understanding that we all do better when we all do better, choosing love over fear, sitting with the discomfort of not knowing in a culture that likes to pretend we do. As individuals and as a community, you have an opportunity to step into and model leadership that supports our ability to be in authentic relationship with and accountable to truly diverse and expansive ways of knowing. A leadership that navigates tension with transparency, a leadership that takes risks knowing that to make a mistake is not to be a mistake, a leadership that is open to new ideas and new ways of thinking, a leadership that is not defensive and not in denial, a leadership that understands your goals will change and shift as you live into them, and that this flexibility is essential to long-term sustainability. A leadership that understands deep in your bones where it matters that racial equity and justice is essential to you, to your community, and to all those you serve. I am deeply impressed with your potential and power to honor and build connection. You have certainly played that role in my life. I hope I've made it clear that your work can offer a direct challenge to white supremacy and racism, that stepping into this challenge includes a call to move beyond the shallow correction of diversity and inclusion, and instead take the time and take the risk to build meaningful and authentic relationships with each other across lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, age, to name just a few, to build meaningful and authentic relationships with stakeholders who you haven't even met yet and who have the potential to expand your potential in ways you can't even imagine, who will broaden and deepen the wisdom needed to meet your goals. What I wish for you is an open-hearted vulnerability that will both serve you well and help you model a new kind of leadership desperately needed in these times. I wish for us all a technology that declares and asserts its ability to connect us across all lines of difference, a technology that helps us live into our values of equity, democracy, and as these times demand, an honoring of our essential interdependence. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tema. If anybody has any questions, you can post them on the chat or on Mattermost. There is one question on Mattermost. Somebody wanted to get the quote right. You are perfect, you are not sure, and then you are enough.
We are perfect, we are wonderful, and we are not enough.
Okay, thank you.
Or we are perfect, we are wonderful, and we have to change.
So I took a lot of notes, Tema, and thank you very, very much. I feel very inspired. I have a question from the point of view. This community has a lot of people who are also international. I am from Latin America, and I have been in this country for several years. And when all of this has bubbled up this year, and I saw many colleagues posting about Black Lives Matters and everything, I felt unqualified to participate. I didn't grow up in this country. I don't understand, and I came to this country with a completely different. I never knew about all of these deep roots of racism, and I don't know how to participate in the conversation as a positive influence. And so maybe what would you recommend to ask people overseas?
Yeah.
And how to be a part of this conversation?
Right. It's a great question. I appreciate the question. I'm not sure I'm completely qualified or even qualified at all to answer it. And I will, since I'm the speaker, I will do my best to give some thoughts to it. One is that what I do know is that as people come here from other countries, they are pretty quickly invited into what this sort of toxic hierarchy of racism, with white at the top, Black at the bottom, and other racialized groups moving up and down depending on what the economy needs. And Indigenous people have been pretty much erased altogether, although so that's the hierarchy, the way that race was constructed in this country. And what I'll say is that there's a wonderful essay by Toni Morrison called On the Backs of Blacks. And you'll find that essay. One of the resources, if people are interested, is a website called dismantlingracism.org, which is the website that we created when the collaborative I was working with closed our doors about 5 years ago and turned all of our resources into a website. But in this essay, Toni Morrison talks about how immigrants, and particularly immigrants from Africa, know that the first thing that they have to do when they come to this country is distance themselves from this category called Black, because it's pretty clear when you get here early at any point, and often people know this before they get here, that to be Black in the U.S. is not a desirable thing. And so it sets up when I talk about this, and I'm talking about how the race construct works. I'm not talking about anybody's lived experience. I think all of my Black colleagues and friends think it's a wonderful thing. So I'm not actually commenting on what it is. I'm commenting on how the race constructs it. So it constructs it as white at the top and Black at the bottom, and people catch on to that pretty quickly when they come here if they haven't caught on to it beforehand. And one of the ways that racism operates to disconnect is to say, okay, I want to be anything but Black, and so it already sets up this disconnection. And even immigrants from Africa will say, I want to be seen as African, not as Black, and so so a lot of the dissonance or discord that happens across lines of race within communities of color is in service of this white supremacy and racism project. So I think one of the things that I think we can all do whether we're immigrants or not, is to notice when we're encouraged to disconnect and to say, no, I'm not going to cooperate with that. Like, I am not going to cooperate with this invitation to disconnect from myself or from you. And if it's me with another white person, I'm not, and that white person is doing something or saying something racist, that is offensive to me, I'm not going to throw you away. I'm going to try and figure out how to be in a relationship with you so we can shift that behavior, because it's not in your best interest. I know that as your friend. Or if it's you, when you're encouraged to disconnect or to engage in anti-Black racism, or to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I want to understand why I'm being encouraged to do this. And there's some also great articles about the myth of the model minority and the ways in which people of Asian descent, Japanese, Chinese, other Asian descent, are encouraged, are positioned as the model minority in opposition to, which only means that we're comparing you to all the other communities of color, which is a disconnect. There's a lot of falseness and setup in that whole characterization of the model minority. And it's also another encouragement to disconnect. We're going to pit you against other people of color because you're doing it right and other people are doing it wrong. It's such the whole thing is such a setup. And so a general rule when you don't know what else to do is, am I being encouraged to disconnect in this moment? And if I am, I'm going to pay attention and try and connect.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a question in here in the Q&A that says, have there been any communities that genuinely incorporate all cultures and races? Are there positive community role models?
Yeah. Yes and no. This is a living project, right? So I would say that, yeah, I've seen, I can give you some examples of specific things that people have done, and some of them are formal and some of them are informal. So, I think an example I want to give, which has to do more specifically with an institutional response to racism, which might be helpful, is that this is not my example, but some colleagues that I know were working with the Department of Social Services in an urban situation in a fairly large city in North Carolina. And the Department of Social Services had a policy where one social worker could decide on their own whether or not to pull a child out of a home. And so it's a lot of power for one person to have. A lot of the social workers were white. A lot of the social workers did not live in the communities where they were pulling children out of. And was causing a lot of distress, and people in those communities or parents were filing a lot of appeals. And they went through some training to sort of think about, to help themselves think differently about it. And what they did as a result was they changed their policies, that when they were thinking about that a child was in danger, what they would do was invite the parent or guardian of that child and anybody else that parent or guardian wanted to invite from the community who cared about that child into the room to talk about what they were going to do. And it changed everything. Just that one simple shift changed everything. And so it's not, and they don't have appeals anymore, and they came up with creative solutions because it was a collective and collaborative. It wasn't a punishing approach. It wasn't one person making this really hard decision on their own. It was a community sort of trying to figure out what's in the best interest of the child. So I don't think it's a complete answer to your question. I can't point to like, here's an organization that's done that, or here's a community that's done that. I can point to all kinds of in the community where I live, we have lots of local and statewide organizations that are working really hard to include people in ways that we don't normally include people. There's a group called Durham Beyond Policing here that's doing a lot of innovative work across lines of race and gender and sexuality. Southerners on New Ground is doing a lot of work, which is an organization that is both people of color centered, and working with the gay LGBTQ plus people, and includes people like me, it's white and upper middle class as you get. So so I can point to efforts, and my guess is wherever you live locally, there are people who are trying to do this. And I belong to an organization, a national organization called SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is our mission is to organize white people to show up for racial justice. And we are not a completely white organization. So we are also trying to work very deliberately across lines of race and class and gender. So I would say there are efforts. I can't point to something where we have conquered. And I think it's going to be a living project for the rest of time. So I would encourage you, I think it is so important to have role models, and I would encourage you to look around locally and see what people are doing, because I'm sure there are people doing things like that. And my guess is, since you asked the question, you're probably doing something like that.
As a follow-up question from the same person, the same participant, it says, in your example, it sounds like one of the main anti-racist solution was involving the community. Is that a general?
Yes, and that's the principle I was talking about, which is that whenever a group of people starts to make a policy or develop a practice, if we're doing that where the people most impacted by the policy or practice aren't in the room, we're creating disconnect. Like, how can we create? And so I think about technology, and I think about anything that we're creating. If the people we are doing it for, on behalf of, in service to, if we're not in relationship with them, how is what we're doing going to be actually authentic and meaningful? I don't think it can be. Those of us, we don't think it can be. And I think about all the, it's such, we have such different standards for people if they're wealthy or if they're poor. So if you're wealthy, the assumption is that you get to have a say in anything that affects you. And I just think about all the laws that get passed in this land, and the role that lobbyists play, and the power that corporations have because they can pay people to lobby on their behalf for their interests. So they're in the room when policies and practices get made that affect their lives. But people who are poor, people who don't have a lot of organized power, are almost never in. They don't have a say over welfare policies, or I just think about all the access to health care, or all of the things that affect our daily lives. So if we're going to shift the way that this sort of toxic crapola works, then one of the things that we can do from whatever position of power we have is look around and say, are the people most affected here in this room? And if not, let's slow this down and get those folks in the room. And our worlds are going to just open up in these wonderful. It's going to be hard at first because we're not used to it, but then it just opens up. So yeah.
So I have a question, and that is, what guidance do you have for, there are these communities that are homogeneous, that are white, and if you're not in that community, how do you get into that community?
It's a great question. I've always been asked, if you're in that community, how do you welcome other people in? I've never been asked, how do you get in? Wow. So I'm going to say what comes to me, and I will probably get myself in trouble because I haven't really thought about this before. So one thing I'll say is, to the extent that it's possible, don't do anything on your own, alone. And I think this is true no matter what position of power we're in. So if you're trying to get access to something that you don't have access to, look around and see who else is with you that wants access to it, and see if you can get it, try and get in as a group, because you'll have a lot more power if you do that. than if you try and do it by yourself. And then I think the other question is then you can ask yourself a couple of questions, like what power do I have, and do others who want access to this have already? And how can we start to collaborate and work together towards the things that we want, whether or not we get in, so that we start to build our own power base. And then the other question is, let's make sure we're conscious of what we're being asked to give up in order to get in. Because if that group is not conscious about the ways that they're excluding you, there's going to be a price to pay for getting in. There always is. It's the price of assimilation. I had a colleague when I was in school who was, probably still is, I haven't seen him in a while, African-American gay man who was a preacher, which is not a hard thing to, it's not an easy thing to do, to have all those identities and be a preacher. And he talked about needing to shed parts of his identity every time he tried to get into spaces that didn't want him, until at the end, he didn't know who he was anymore, except for the socks he put on in the morning. So there's, and I think this is true of poor white people too, newly arrived immigrants, like what do I have to shed in order to belong to the group that has access to power and resources? So, and I'm not saying you don't do it, I'm just saying, just cautioning that it's important to make sure we're staying aware of what it is that we're being asked to give up, so that we're doing that with as much deliberation and intent as we can, so that we can reclaim parts of ourselves when we need to. So that's my answer. The main thing is don't do anything alone. And if we're in a white group trying to welcome people in, don't do that alone either. It's like, make that a collective and collaborative project.
Okay. In one of your podcasts, I remember a statement that you made about, why people create their own communities, right? Because they, and if you just want to sort of, comment on that.
Well, so often there's probably two parts to that question. One of the things that I do a lot is I lead white affinity groups. So groups of white people who are meeting in order to understand our role in reproducing racism and to interrupt that and to show up differently. And then my colleagues lead Black affinity groups, people of color affinity groups. So there's that kind of configuration where people are working as a community, as a whole community, trying to tackle racism or some other social justice project, and meet in affinity groups in order to, because while white supremacy and racism affect all of us, they affect us differently. They're going to affect me differently than they affect you, based on our different racial identities. So sort of figuring that out and thinking that through can be, it can be useful to do that as in our affinity groups, and then it helps us actually to meet together more strongly and to work together more effectively. And then there are ways in which I think any group that's been pushed to the margins can gain a sense of, does gain a sense of power. And this is what movement building is: a sense of power, a sense of identity, a sense of taking back, like I am, or as the civil rights movement sign said, I am a man, I am a person, I am part of a community. That gathering together in your own groups, it's sort of like, it's what women's groups did during the 60s and 70s when I was coming of age. It's like groups of women would meet together to talk about what it's like to be a woman in a very sexist culture, and what, how we want to navigate that in different ways. So I think it's so important for people to be able to meet and create their own healing, thinking, ideation projects that meet their needs and build their power in a culture that is constantly sending messages that you're not okay, or that you have no power, or that you don't have genius, or that you don't, I think it's healing. It's healing medicine to get together and say, we are genius. We are, we are wonderful. We have lots and lots of value. And just because you don't see it doesn't mean we don't have it. And we're going to claim it for ourselves no matter what. And we see that, it's in the reclaiming of language. It's in the, we see examples of it all the time, and those examples can be role models for us. So the ways in which the LGBTQ plus community reclaimed the word queer, or the language that went from African to African American to Afro American to Black, sort of just a claiming, or the ways that Indigenous people claim their own language about how they're going to be named, and all of that is just, it's part of saying, I am here and I have value no matter what you're saying to me as a larger culture.
Since I don't see more questions coming in through the channels here, I do have one question. I'm also a professor in the university, a professor of engineering. And so I was looking here frantically because I remembered some notes I had taken at some point about some work that has been published that suggests that STEM faculty who believe that ability is fixed have larger racial achievement gaps in their students, and they inspire less the students to succeed. So I wanted to ask you for ideas to counter that, or not only as a professor teaching my students, but also as a colleague, perhaps inviting colleagues to think about this, so collectively we can do better.
Right. So one of the cohorts that we work with in the Teach Equity Now program is a health professional educators cohort, and there are a lot of STEM or STEM-like faculty in that cohort. And so the key word that you said is that they believe that. So there's plenty of research to dispute any idea that any kind of knowing is racially limited. So one of the things that we talk about in our program is, and it's what I talked about at the beginning of this talk, which is that there's the content, there's what people know or what a program is doing, and then there's the how, there's the process. And so much of what educators need to understand, and this is here I feel I'm really solid ground because my field is education. What educators need to understand is that the how is as important, if not more important, than the what. And if we don't understand that our students are bringing emotionally lived lives into the classroom, and that so the research on the correlation between our expectations and student performance is overwhelming. So if we have limited expectations for students, they know that, and it's going to be hard to live into their brilliance about a subject. And I say this also based on my own experience. I remember, so I'm entitled in almost every way. I grew up in an upper middle class family. I went to Oberlin College, which is a pretty elite school in the Midwest. And I took science. It was a big chemistry class. And I remember going up to the professor to ask a question. And he basically said to me, "You're not science material. I don't have time for you." So, and I just take that little experience, which is a unique individual experience for me, and it's a pervasive experience for lots of students of color. And I remember how I felt in that moment. I was angry, I was deflated, and then I internalized it, and ever since I've believed I'm no good at science. And what difference it would have made if he had said, "Oh, you really want to know this? Let's talk. My job is to develop your science gene." So there's a deep connection between what we expect and what students are capable of. And then there's a deep connection between our understanding that a student's belief and their ability to do something is going to impact their ability to do it. So what are we doing in our classrooms to notice students' emotional lived experience, what students are going through? And so it can be simple things like, on a day, this isn't simple, it's actually profound and horrible, but on a day when George Floyd is murdered in front of our eyes, are we taking time in class to, if and when people show up, to say something horrible has happened today? We're going to take a breath about that to see if we can actually focus on the content, because maybe we can't. Or if a student doesn't come to class, rather than punish them, go, tell me why you weren't in class. Was this a really hard day for you? It's like starting to understand learning as more than just the specific content. And then there are all kinds of ways of reorienting how you're teaching your content. So there's this brilliant faculty member, and she's published, and I'm pretty sure the resources on the website that I mentioned. She's published an article about how she front-loaded. She realized that she was assuming students were coming into her STEM class knowing a set of things, and she realized that people were coming with very disparate preparation. So she preloaded a class and made it available online to explain concepts, and it's made a huge difference in everybody's performance. And here's the thing, and here's the secret to racial equity, the magic of racial equity, which is that when we either individually or collectively think about how we're going to better serve students of color, or students who've been targeted, or students who are marginalized, whatever the reason, we're going to serve all students. It's good for all students. And when we're only thinking about how to serve the students who are already excelling, then we're going to marginalize a lot of people. So it's about both sort of honoring that there's an emotional content to learning, honoring the different preparation that people have coming into the classroom, and monitoring your own expectations as the teacher for students, and faking it if you don't actually have it. And what I will tell you from my experience, and I've been teaching for 25 years now, is that I'm always surprised. I will make assumptions about what students are capable of when they come into the classroom, and I've learned to notice that I'm making the assumption and then to set it aside, because I'm always surprised if I allow myself to be surprised. And it's interesting, it's interesting to me that STEM professors will not, I mean, I just notice our own contradictions. Like, you're a STEM professor, you're sort of steeped in this idea of science and research, and yet you are leaning on a belief that is not actually research valid. So, maybe people get defensive, but maybe there's a way to sort of say, you want to rethink this? It's a belief, it's not actually real.
There's another question in the chat. Thank you for that. That was a really good insight. As an organization who strives to be global, are there any particular things to pay attention to that are different from local and national concerns?
I'm sure there are. I'm very U.S. focused, and I feel very unequipped to talk about global or international issues or ways of thinking, except to say that we're able to connect in ways across borders that I couldn't have imagined when I was growing up, and we're able to share knowledge and share misinformation in ways that we weren't able to before. So I don't feel equipped to answer that question, except to know that it's an important one, and a great one to be asking people who are in a better position to answer it. I will say related to my topic that I do believe that white supremacy and racism were perfected in this country in the form that it exists in now, and we're exporting it at a pretty rapid rate. That white people don't have to be present for white supremacy to be at work, for this idea of capital and power to be the most important things, which is really what is the basis of white supremacy.
I was thinking about your statement earlier about in this country, when immigrants come, about the white at the top and black at the bottom and different groups. And I was born in India, and it's actually not so different from there as well.
Yeah,
so.
There's usually some kind of racial. I don't know of a place where there's not a racialized hierarchy. And even what into us as outsiders might appear, two different white groups would have racialized hierarchies, right? And they're racialized, and they're not about race. I mean, both things are true. It's like race isn't real, but it's real. Like there's a lot, we're navigating a lot of very strong contradictions.
There's another a question about diversity, say, being helpful when looking at sports. It's an area where, it has been open to various groups and it's done well. And is this extensible to other fields?
Yeah, I think wherever we feel like we see examples of people being able to make connections across lines where the culture discourages those connections, music, art, yes, we should definitely look to those for models. And what I would say is in those areas, it's because people are more interested in the thing than they are in being involved in the disconnection, and that anything that brings us into relationship with each other around things that we mutually love is going to show us, oh, actually, I can be in relationship with people that I've been told I'm not supposed to be in a relationship with, and those places can be magic. They can also be really challenging, and they can be challenging because the assumption is always, even in a sports context, the assumption is always that there's a way to do something, and it's often the right way of doing something, and we'll all succeed if we all agree on the right way of doing it or adapt to the right way of doing it. So I think because it's sports and it's a team and it's a game and you want to win, it might be more open to, let's think about other ways of doing it. And you will find plenty of evidence of athletes of color talking about the discrimination they faced in the sports world. So it's definitely a both and. There's not a space that's free of this, and there are spaces where people are doing a better job of being able to be authentically with each other. And we do want to learn. We absolutely do want to learn from those spaces, for sure. Yeah.
Lorena, do you have any questions? I have one last question when we finish up, but in case you had any more questions? No. Okay. So one last question is, when we had a discussion about, are things getting better? And you said that the questions that people are asking, as someone who does community work, been doing it for 6 years, it's really difficult to measure impact. I need like some incentive, motivation to keep going. And the questions, you said the questions people are asking are different now. And if you could, elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I have been doing this work quite a long time, and I have seen sort of an arc of progress. I'm not crazy about that word, but I've seen an arc of shifting of understanding. And like when I started doing this work, most people didn't know that race was constructed. It wasn't biologically real. And now many, many, many people understand that. And so I feel like the general air is full of greater and better understanding of how racism and white supremacy operate. And that's a good thing, because if we have shared language and a shared understanding, then we can tackle something together. I also think that one thing I see shifting is that, and one thing that's really important, I'm not sure I spoke to this explicitly, is that another assumption of racial equity work in the past has been that racial justice is for the benefit of people of color, and we're going to lift people of color into a white world, and that's the goal. And I think what I see changing, which is really, really critical, is that more and more white people understanding that that's not the goal, that we have as much direct stake in racial justice as people of color do, that white supremacy and racism does not actually serve us, no matter how much privilege it actually gives us. That privilege in the end is toxic because it disconnects us from each other and from ourselves. And I think that shift, that is a really fundamental and important shift, that this is not about simply including people into a white world. It's about questioning this the world, the way that we do business, and trying to think about ways of doing business that actually serve the values that you all say are important to the tech community and that are important to all of us. This ability to connect, this ability to understand that we all do better when we all do better. This ability, so, and this gets to the global question that we are all interconnected. There is no, independence is not really a thing. It's not a thing. Nobody does anything in isolation from anyone or any, we don't operate in isolation. Interdependence is a thing. And so as we become a global community, that becomes more and more obvious. And so this idea that it's not about inviting people into a way of being and doing that actually doesn't work for any of us. It's about really reconsidering how we want to be with each other. And I think that, to me, is where my hopefulness lies.
I think if there's one thing that exemplifies interdependence, it is this pandemic, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So before we end, if you just want to share, how people can get in touch with you and what your research is and what your trainings are, if they're interested in learning more and bringing it to their organizations, companies, communities.
Sure. So I mentioned the website before. It's called dismantlingracism.org. And if you go to that website, you can send a message to me through the website. On the contact page, it'll come directly to me. I work with an organization called Teach Equity Now. We're fairly new. We don't have a website yet. And what we do is we provide programming for faculty and organizations. We have a 4-part series that helps people start an equity process or continue an equity process by offering shared language, a shared framework, shared understanding of history, which we feel like is essential as you try and embed an equity commitment into what you're doing. So we do that. And my current research is on, people may be familiar that I think you came to me, Reshma, through my white supremacy culture article, which is the piece I've written that has gotten the most viewing or the most traction. And so I wrote it quite a while ago, so I'm creating a website to update that and to expand it and to connect it to other, again, technology connecting, to connect it to other sources. And my interest in my talks and my writing now is about the stake that white people have in racial justice, because I feel like it's so important for us to understand that we have a direct stake, and this is not about a moral imperative, it's about saving our souls, if you will.
And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a fabulous talk.
Thank you for having me.